Last I looked, I heard like 27 states or somewhere in that, the last I checked, had at least looked into legalizing or making it legal tender or taking off the tax that's on it in the state. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that a approximate right number?
So that is I'll say that in 2024, this past year that just ended, there was more than 65 pieces of legislation introduced across more than 27 states. So what we're saying is more than about 60% of the country is actively considering changing legislation that allows investors to buy gold and silver without being taxed, sales tax or capital gains tax. States that are introducing legislation to establish gold reserves, to bolster state funds and pension funds, for example, with physical gold held within the state. So there is so much electricity behind this movement, and that was 2024. And so the end result of that was 7 states passing legislation.
Okay.
That legislation that, like I mentioned, sales tax, capital gains tax, reaffirming legal tender status. And then in Utah, interestingly, it was the bill that allowed the state to invest $180 million in physical gold to be held on the state's balance sheet. This is becoming more and more of a trend, right? You hear a lot about BRICS talk and a lot about de-dollarization. And the implication there is that, wow, countries that have an adversarial relationship with the United States are moving away from the dollar. But if you look closer, you'll see that it's not just countries with adversarial relationships to the United States. In some cases, it's allies. It's countries that are allies whose central banks are stockpiling gold. And in other instances, it's states. The states of the United States themselves, more and more of them, almost a dozen already this year, have introduced legislation to establish gold reserves, to establish, in some case, digital currency reserves, Bitcoin reserves, things like that. So I think the big theme here is that, whether you're an enemy or an ally or even a part of the United States itself, there is a lot of interest in moving away from dollar-denominated assets and investing in something that know's purchasing power will last and has lasted for thousands of years.
Wow, that's awesome. I know we kind of touched on this, but what are some of the biggest holdups that you see when you approach a state? What's something that keeps coming up, or kind of something reoccurring, or that stands out to you, anything like that?
The largest thing, probably the most common thing, would be issues with fiscal notes. This is kind of a wonky term. It's a document that the state ascribes to every single piece of legislation that gets introduced that says what it will cost the state to enact. So each state, every single piece of proposed legislation in most states has a proposed price tag, essentially. The thing is that most states don't carry granular data enough on just gold and silver. So in many cases, state tax forms, don't have sections for gold and silver bullion. It will be included in a section that includes jewelry and other assets like this. So it's impossible to really get a number on how much a state really sells, how much the state should collect in taxes based on that, because it's really impossible to know. The state doesn't really collect that information. And unfortunately, that means that there tends to be a lot of leeway with how these fiscal notes are put together. So occasionally, if you get, for example, I think a capital gains bill that we worked on in Georgia last year had a fiscal note of, I believe, almost $20 million. The state said that it would lose out on if it stopped collecting capital gains on gold and silver.
Wow.
That same piece of legislation was introduced in Iowa, where we passed it out of the House of Representatives, and the fiscal note there was $400,000. So this is a lot more art than science, and it's barely art. And in some cases, you might have departments of revenue or legislative offices that might not necessarily like a piece of legislation and could potentially use a fiscal note to tank its prospects of passage. So that's one that we get hung up on a lot. Occasionally, like I mentioned, states don't want to lose tax revenue. The idea of not taxing things means that they have less to spend, so they try to avoid that. Recently, a really interesting constitutional legal battle that's brewing in the state of Kentucky right now. This past year, after a multi-year effort, Sound Money Defense League, Money Metals Exchange, we passed legislation in Kentucky that says that purchases of precious metals are exempt from the state sales tax.
Okay.
This is a great win in Kentucky. It became the 46th state in the country to end this tax.
Nice.
But unfortunately, the governor vetoed the bill and said, if you have money to invest in gold, you have money to pay taxes. And the governor then directed his Department of Revenue to collect the tax, regardless of what the legislature said and voted on, and told the Department of Revenue, you will continue collecting this tax, and if bullion dealers do not comply, they will be met with the penalty of legal action. So they've created this structure. The issue is the governor doesn't have the power to veto the bill that he vetoed. In the state constitution of Kentucky, it says that the governor can only apply vetoes to certain bills. The bill that the gold and silver sales tax exemption was included in was not one of those bills. The governor overstepped his power. The attorney general wrote an opinion saying the governor cannot do this. This is an illegitimate, unconstitutional veto. But still, the governor said, no. Governor Beshear said, I don't care what the legislature wants. I don't care what people of the state want. I know what's best, so the Department of Revenue will continue collecting this tax.
Wow.
So now, I'm happy to say, just last week, 2 pieces of legislation were introduced in Kentucky. The first was to a reintroduction of the sales tax bill. If the governor didn't like it this time, the state just decided, okay, we'll pass it again. We'll ram it down your throat. Wow. If you didn't like it the first time, we'll pass it again. The second piece of legislation is one that incentivizes taxpayers in the state to sue the governor and to sue state agencies for wrongful taxation of gold and silver purchases. Wow. It's incredible. The legislature is incentivizing citizens of the state to bring legal action to the state because they are obviously being wronged by the Departments of Revenue and by the governor himself on this issue. So there is an incredible amount of electricity around this now. Kentucky is an exciting place. Obviously, it would have been great to get the sales tax removed and have it become the 46th, but because of that veto and because of where we're at now, we're still only at 45, but we're hopeful that with this legislation and with the grassroots energy that we have in the bluegrass state, that this upcoming year we'll be able to get more done there.
Wow, good job Kentucky on bringing the pressure there. That's impressive that they kept at it like that.